these were the presentations of panel 2 toward ecologies of art and curating, and I will begin with a short question to each of the presenters, and then we'll try to weave this into a patchwork, a radical care patchwork. Right, so TJ, you said, in your speech, you moved from mitigation to adaptation and pointed out traditions of the oppressed and mobilizing locally. So here is my question, but at the same time, you talked about, of course, futurisms and futurity. So adaptation, I sense a slight contradiction, or should I say tension between adaptation and futurisms or futurities. So to weave in quickly, Benjamin Bratton's essay talking about for planetary governance, in which he says the name refers to the need to fundamentally transform Earth's cities, technologies, and ecosystems to ensure that the planet will be capable of supporting Earth-like life. Artificiality, astronomy, and automation form the basis of that alternative planetarity. For this, the question of governance, knowing, modeling, mobilization, regulation, distribution, enforcement comes to the fore. This determines how some futures might be prevented so that others can be composed and realized. Would you propose indigenous knowledge or raciality, gender, and so the traditions of the oppressed, to use a Benjaminian term, as key to planetary governance?
I would, and let me just clarify. I was mentioning that the transition within climate governance policymaking from mitigation to adaptation that's happening widely. It's been happening, for instance, at the UN climate summits for the last few years. And I find this politically fatalistic. So in other words, instead of attempting to address the causality of climate breakdown within forms of petrocapitalism or fossil fuel capitalism, people, policymakers, and negotiators are moving on to asking, how can we adapt? In other words, it's an accommodationist relation to fossil capital. Instead of attempting to commit to system change, we're agreeing to accommodate ourselves to climate change. This is a massive political failure. I don't think it's so much what Amitav Ghosh called a failure of the imagination. This is a failure of politics for me. So in terms of Bratton's approach, he's of course involved with the Strelka Institute in Moscow and the Terraforming Project. And from my analysis of that project, what it's proposing basically is a kind of technogenic future of automation where geotechnologies, including geoengineering, will provide solutions in advance of any form of geogovernance. And for me, I find this incredibly problematic and even a kind of recipe for fascism, a kind of authoritarianism of technology. So I think, from my analysis, that's the last thing that we need. Certainly we need system change. But I think what is so crucial about invoking indigenous approaches to environmental relationality, relations to the more than human world, is that it's based within long histories of climate justice struggles. And it's those struggles and the insistence on democracy, accountability, transparency, and responsibility. It's exactly this that the Terraforming Project of Bratton completely dismisses. And actually, if you read the Terraforming document, he has nothing but contempt for climate justice struggles. that he sees as getting in the way of a kind of climate realist approach to moving immediately toward adaptive technologies like geoengineering. And so this is, at one with the kind of approach of basically climate adaptation within the larger framework of capitalism. There's no political resistance. It's simply an attempt to narrowly define environmental solution so that we're adjusting decarbonization in the atmosphere and trying to slow down climate disruption, but do absolutely nothing to change the conditions of economic, social, and political inequality that we know has led to centuries of climate and also social injustice. So this is a real problem that I see, and an area where I think it's really necessary for us to address this and think about what climate justice really means. And for that, I think indigenous approaches like that of the Red Nation, these are crucial. So thanks for that question.
Tapping into panel one as well. So we've identified as deep time as something that should be rendered palpable and tangible. Awareness, mobilization around that, also speculation and spectrality of it all. And Maya and Ruben, you pointed out how the eco-triennial back in 1980 already addressed the failure of socialism to relate to environmental change and future catastrophe. So, and again, tapping into panel one, for those who are still with us, I will perhaps phrase the question through the matrix question. Apart from would you like the blue pill or the red pill, is there a green pill that kind of leapfrogs the two, the red and the red and the blue pill?
Okay, so
let's start. Thanks so much for the question or questions about the pills, also the history of the biennial or the triennial, which is something which is really important, which we tried to bring out also.
Yeah, but it shouldn't be mistaken the history of actually existing socialism and its impacts on the environmental histories of the time, which is what we were referring to, and then make it equal to the potential of socialisms to deal with the environmental crisis. So we're making a distinction there, the actually existing socialist system that was there for half a century in a large part of the planet, and which had a very specific environmental policies which left a particular impact in the creation of the Anthropocene as we know it, and it's not always acknowledged because sometimes it's simply taken as another form of capitalism, since it was a growth-oriented economic system as well, and extractivist and exploitative. But it is really interesting that imagining the end of capitalism, we can also look back at imagining the end of socialism as it existed. And actually, the environmental crisis that it did produce, and this is where the Maribor Triennial addressed it very correctly, was its in ignorance and the disregard to environmental cases, which produce extreme toxicity and pollution and extractivism and problems so acute, according to some historians. It was a trigger, and in many cases in Eastern Europe, it was a trigger to start the revolutionary movements and civil society movements in the 1980s to bring down them. So there are potential histories in the history of existing socialism which could help imagine the futurist socialisms that may come as well in terms of where we are now. I don't know if this is a green pill or red pill or blue pill, however you want to interpret it.
And maybe also just to say a word to continue about the conversation about adaptation, also in response to what TJ was saying just a moment before, and that question of adaptation, whether that is always and automatically has to mean adaptation through the current system of technology and this technosocial way, or whether just thinking about how do we adapt to climate change, to the extremities of climate change, can also, in some cases, lead to a more systematic view of transformation. I mean, just take the example of agriculture. You know, if you realize that, you know, as Jason Moore also pointed out, that you know, climate change limits to capitalism and, for example, to the model of industrial agriculture based on geoengineered crops and chemical input, then you know, adapting to that may also be a way of leading you back to more traditional approaches in terms of caring for the soil, or looking at indigenous ways of being more connected to the soil and so on. There may also be a route through thinking about climate adaptation to a radical transformation as well. And also, if you think about you know, the sources of adaptation, people can also have looked, for example, at indigenous technologies or other kinds of technologies. It could be about kind of expanding the idea of technology. When you say technology, not necessarily just give it in terms of what we commonly assume to be technology, which is a certain kind of technology, but also a broader understanding, which also includes indigenous forms of architectures, but also ways of taking to the soil, of energy use, and so on. So, you know, just to maybe that bigger question, quite an interesting one, can also be quite productive as well.
I like how we're moving away from what might be perhaps a cynical reproach to some of the art and or curating and its treatment of the environment as nostalgia for the past, or maybe even nostalgia for the present, or, God forbid, nostalgia for the future. Lucia, you've drawn a brilliant strategic map of how to approach these issues. So I would just like you to kind of elaborate. I saw the book there, More Than Human. If you could, since we're talking about all of these deep things, deep stuff, if you could elaborate on deep future as a more than human future, like a post-anthropocentric, post-anthropocenic future.
Thank you for the question. It's a tough question. I have the book as like a real life PowerPoint right here. Well, I can tell you what the sort of more than human research has been up to this point. We started, Philippa and I started from thinking about the differential interpretations that would open themselves up if we looked from a non-necessarily anthropocentric perspective at the circle of sand made by a pufferfish at the bottom of the ocean. And by just kind of shifting slightly the coordinates of the interpretive movement, that led us to think about a series of convenings and gatherings that would try to think about the kind of initial premise was consciousness as a more than human thing. But in the actuality of it, it actually just convening by convening, gathering by gathering, and sort of started to unpick assumptions that go with a certain kind of anthropocentrism. A few things emerged that I think point towards the future and point towards your question as part of this. Firstly, a very important thing, which is that anthropocentrism is not actually the centrality of the human subject, but the centrality of a very specific human subject who self-defined as a very specific point of the Enlightenment, and that the ontological reality of Enlightenment, of the abstraction that was Enlightenment thought, was the extractive relationship of you know, there was like an ontological counterpoint that funded the Renaissance in the shape of the sort of genocide of indigenous peoples and extraction of gold from South America. And that went with the enslavement of people, and it went with the development of financial capitalism. So all of these things are kind of connected in a sort of, the metaphor and the material of it are connected. And they lead to a notion of anthropocentrism that is actually, you know, profoundly unjust, kind of at the root of it. But the second thing that also emerged is slightly more maybe poetic, but was this idea that that because of this tendency that we have to create, to sort of define things in the image, in our own image, and it doesn't take a sort of, you don't need anyone to tell you that God is not an old white man with a beard, but that may have led us to define things like love, like generosity, like consciousness, like intelligence, like divinity, and all of those things in the images in which we as humans experience it, as opposed to thinking of the human version of those things being emergences out of a complex, messy, more than human, entangled kind of sort of soup. And so I suppose the paradigmatic shift that it points towards in the future is one that simultaneously tries to unfix this very specific anthropocentrism and reattach whilst reattaching everything to a kind of more than human relational, and therefore sort of a relational existence, and therefore a set of responsibilities, accountabilities, necessities for mutualities and reciprocities, and so on.
I'll move to Elke for a quick question, and then please feel free to riff off what's been said. I will also try to entangle the chat, the web chat. So Elke, locality, mobilizing locality. I'll perhaps paraphrase Joseph Beuys's everyone is an artist to everyone is an artist, a curator, a researcher, a designer, a programmer, a technologist, and so on. Would this locality, extension of such a locality, perhaps produce a good model of planetary governance? Because we don't have time. That's my point. We're talking about deep time, of course, but if we think of 2030 and 2050, we don't have time for the deep time to sink in, so then we can, accelerate.
I think it's a really interesting question, whom we quote. I mean, whom do we quote into existence, and who is our ancestor? So I would never quote Beuys. And I think we were at this question before. So who are the allies, and who are the ones who allow us to be allies with them? And I think this is the most complex question to ask. How can we build these allyships locally and translocally and understand? So TJ was speaking a lot how to build relations and relationships with indigenous activism, but also others spoke about indigenous cosmologies and ontologies. And how do we do this today? So me as a white person living in Central Europe, with the kind of approach that will actually come with all people's attachments, and then move to something that goes beyond that. And so I guess I'm trying to say Beuys is not there.
Do you want to, I mean, you can engage if you want before I turn to the chat. All right, I'll turn to the chat.
Only to pay homage to all of the presentations. Thank you for sharing this time, because it was really a joy to listen.
So Luka Omladic, a speaker from panel 1, has the following question. So is it possible that aestheticizing ecological loss becomes harmful for environmental efforts? Ruben, I see you. Speak up.
Well, just because the reference to ecological loss makes me think about what we were presenting about the glaciers, because that really is the, that's we're dealing. If you think about particularly the situation with the cryosphere and with the melting of ice, is a situation where there isn't actually that much that can be done, because these things are melting, and it's already also built into the carbon emissions are already going to play out over the next 50 years or so, that for most, which are also natural entities in their own right, there's basically either gone or on their way, and that it is one of these real tragedies. It's part of the kind of mass extinction. Okay, it's the mass extinction of species. It's also an of landscape and complex ecosystems, and that such as glass are also being directly affected by climate change. So then you have the question: how should artists respond to that? And maybe that isn't a point when you're dealing with a glacier, which is also obviously the starting point for this eco-triennial edition of the eco-triennial. If you're dealing with the glacier, you can't really, not really a model that you can propose be scaled up in terms of trying to save the glacier, apart from trying to change the whole system that we're in, really radically, really quickly. There's nothing that can be done, just like you put white cloths over the glacier to save it from rising temperatures, so that there's no sort of model. And so what can artists do? And what I think we were trying to point to is the way that artists are trying to deal with that grief, and also to kind of express something towards something that we're causing, that humanity, or the Western version of humanity is inflicting and is continuing to inflict on these natural entities on the glaciers. So by creating some kinds of rituals or ceremonies for helping people to understand what's happening, and also directing it towards the glacier itself, to maybe expressing some kind of acknowledging responsibility for what's happened. And I suppose the only way forward then is that could actually be a spur to other aspects of the ecological crisis. It might be a chance to do something, to turn that into something which could be more effective, where things still can be changed. So that's the kind of interesting point. But if the question of aestheticizing, the practice, I'm not sure exactly what the questioner is thinking of, because although some of the practices, they're quite nice images, they're not really about aestheticizing as such. They're really about rituals. They're kind of research-based practices, which are about really, engaging with communities, working with people to try and understand what's happening. And they're not really kind of about producing a sort of aestheticizing situation or experience or object as such.
Can I jump in there quickly?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sure.
Okay, just to say that it really depends on how you define aesthetics, right? Whether to aestheticize is a mode of beautification according to classical Western Enlightenment approaches to aesthetics, or whether it's alternately something that's deeply entangled with politics in terms of bringing visibility to different ways of living. And I think that latter approach to aesthetics can be really something that's deeply needed these days, especially if we can talk about bringing visibility and new perceptual approaches to thinking complexly about the relation between mitigation and adaptation, as Ruben, I think, was alluding to before, which I would agree with, or whether aesthetics can bring visibility and forms of effective power to ethical and political relationships, like allyship, or of forms of solidarity, or whether aesthetics can bring visibility to ways of transforming our institutions, so that our institutions themselves, including within the arts, are not continuing to be beholden to forms of neoliberal capitalism that we know is responsible largely for environmental breakdown. So I think aesthetics, if we can, this is really the challenge of thinking, writing, and teaching about aesthetics, to prevent it from being, enclosed within a very limiting and superficial understanding of our relationship to the multi-sensory experience. So I think thinking about aesthetics and its relationship to bringing visibility to structural analysis of the challenges of climate breakdown under fossil, racial, and colonial capitalism is exactly what we need to be thinking about and looking at.
Lucia?
I agree.
Great, I like this governance panel here. I think we would come far. Okay, let me see. All right, so Bojana, Iris, Kos, Grabar, and this goes to everyone on the panel. How do you understand radical? So what's radical? Okay, maybe.
I'll start out just because I tried to define that in my presentation. I'm thinking about radical in an ecological sense, where radical means, again, going to the roots of things in terms of the connectivity within the web of life that we can find if we think literally about like mycorrhizal networks that connects trees underground in relationship to bacteria and fungi. That's a classic kind of ecological approach to the radical, which is similar to the rhizome and these networks of connectivity that are biological and geological, within the physical realm. But then there's also radical within a political economy, or political ecology, where radical means, for me, and for many other people, it means going to the structural conditions of how our forms of life are organized politically, economically, technologically. So radical would, in that sense, necessarily involve thinking about how to completely transform those structural conditions so that we can escape from this suicidal cycle of climate breakdown. So ultimately, radical in that sense has to involve a structural critique of forms of capitalism, forms of racism, and forms of colonialism in which we're entangled still to this day. So radical carries all of those different implications.
Okay.
I mean, I would agree with everything that was just said. I guess in historical terms, there are many different radical traditions. So it's important to say which one we are aligned with and which ones we hate and which ones we would never mention. It's not an innocent term. I mean, there's radical people everywhere, and there is people who claim radicality for their very different purposes. So there are traditions of radical feminism that I feel aligned with. And then there are many other radical traditions that are toxic and harmful and useless. I think the question of going to the root of things, so going deeper and unearthing why things are wrong is what I would provide as a most basic approach or definition.
And all this on the centenary of the one who we shall not name. Lucia?
I hate being the one who goes, I have nothing to add. But truly, I mean, I think sort of bringing what I'd be interested in kind of thinking about, and can't right now, but would be like, what would bringing back the mycorrhizal, the root work, and the actual fact of the way that roots work into a sort of politically radical environment demand of that very environment. So what kind of reknitting and strategic kind of alliances and what kind of other ways of being would be called upon by linking those two things closer together, I think is a really interesting challenge to pose oneself within a kind of radical framework, radical political framework. And indeed is being done.
Maya, Ruben?
I tend to agree with Elke in terms of thinking that we live through in extremely radical times. And there's radicalism constant, online, offline, as we move. We encounter radicalism of all kinds, especially the toxic radicalisms which are arising from many current political situations across the globe. And this is something we feel on our skin. So when we think about radicalism, we kind of often think of it in very idealistic terms of like going to roots and being really radical and, you know, situated radicalisms, which can make better and change to better. But what we are actually encountering is this kind of, or what is prevalent at the moment is this kind of other kind of radicalisms, which we kind of tend to overlook. But this is what we really, especially across the region, I would say, and online as well. And this is something that is very, very toxic and very present.
Elke?
I think it's interesting to think about words that don't fit so well with radical. So I was just thinking about radical peace, and it's not something I would say very often. So there was radical peace being made, and so I guess I'm trying to ask, where is radical not useful, or where have we not yet learned to understand a condition as radical, that radical repair, radical. So I think there are many humble or complex conditions that haven't been associated with radicality, and maybe we need to think about why they have remained outside of the radical imaginary to a degree. Maybe I'm totally wrong, just thinking out loud.
Ruben?
People sometimes talk about radical care. So Elke, that would be an example of that, where people are putting together care and the radical, which would somehow, but don't necessarily go together, but could actually suggest something new, and maybe kind of temper maybe the little bit the forcefulness of radicality, which doesn't always sit with this kind of more cooperative sense of roots, also like sharing and cooperation and so on. The radicality maybe is a bit of an edgy term, so maybe like by pairing it with something like care, like radical care, can soften it a little bit and make it more useful.
Well, TJ Demos, Lucia Petroiusti, Elke Krasny, Maya and Ruben Folks, a radical thank you from my end. This has been panel 2 of a Letter to the Future toward Radical and Creative Ecologies conference, part of the EKO8 International Triennial of Art and Environment. A big thank you as well to our speakers before. At panel 1, Andris Ner Magnason, Marjetica Potrč, and Luka Omladic. Thank you also in the web chat for participating with comments and questions, and of course for watching. This is what the Letter to the Future by Andris Ner Magnason says. Åkjökull is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all of our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it. Well, let's see if there isn't, in the end, a planet where all of this, what we're doing now, including our species, is just pure archaeology. Until next time, keep safe and take care.